Let's have a play with the 107 ScrawlrBox.
Hey Scrawlers, I'm Kat from ScrawlrBox and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to get into some of those tips and tricks as featured in the 107 zine. Let's get into it.
Inside this month's box is a zine, as always, with some tips and tricks on how to use this month's supplies. There's also a bit of insight from our featured artist too on how she created the featured print. Let's have a go at making something fun. I'll be using the watercolour paper as featured in the box, and it's a hot press paper with a slight texture to it. And 2 pots of water as we are painting. Right then, let's get prepped. To get started, we're going to activate our watercolours, and to do that we need to drop each paint pan with a little drop of water. You can just use a wet paintbrush to do this, or if you've got one of those little spray bottles, that's also handy too. We'll let that sit for a little minute while we do our sketch. I'll be using the pencil that was featured in the box, and this is the Faber-Castell Goldfarber pencil in 4B. It's a nice soft graphite, so it comes out quite dark. So don't push too hard or you will get quite dark graphite lines that are hard to get rid of afterwards. Once I've done my sketch, I tend to erase the lines down anyway. And then I'm just gonna go ahead and do some basic sketching here. Nothing too detailed. I know what I want to paint already, so I'm just putting in the lines as a little guide. This will help keep me focused and keep things in proportion. Not that tomatoes require a lot of proportion, but there we go. Anyway, paints look ready. Let's get on with it. I'm going to start with the background, so I'm going to water down some of that nice bright blue. This will create a nice little wash to work with, and I can build it up if I feel like it's too light. The great thing about these paints is they are quite bright, so even when they are watered down, you still got that lovely pop of pigment. Once I've painted in all of the background, I'm going to let that dry absolutely thoroughly. That's probably the best advice I could ever give for watercolours, is to make sure each layer is completely dry before you go back on top. This way it will prevent any unwanted smudging, bleeding and muddying of the colours. Also highly recommend cleaning your palette in between applications, just because it prevents, again, any unwanted colour mixing. And speaking of mixing, we don't have a black in this palette, but that's no problem. So to mix my shadows, I'm going to use complementary colours. So I'll use the orange and the blue to make a grey brown. I find mixing your shadow colours this way less harsh on the page as well. Again, let that layer dry, clean up your palette, and you're good to go for your next round. Next, we're moving on to those big tomatoes. I'm going to mix 2 of the reds to make a more tomatoey red. This time I'm going to wet the page first and use a wet on wet technique to apply the paint to the page. This gives me a light base to work from, and it will also dry down with a slight bloomy effect, which will add some nice subtle textures in there. I'm all about the textures. I'm not going for full on realism, but seeing as I've gone ahead and added shadows, I'm going to keep my light areas light with a quick dab of tissue to remove the pigment. That's also a handy tip if you make a mistake. Make sure you dab the paint while it's still wet and it will pick up most of the pigment. And we're going to let that layer dry. On to layer 2, using a wet on dry technique this time to build up more intensity. And let that layer dry again, and onto another layer. And this time I'm going to add more of that darker red into there. Again, building up more contrast within those lights and darks. You could also add in a pop of complementary colour into this. That would work just as well to build up shadows, but I wanted to keep this more bright. Adding in a complementary colour will dull down the colour. I decided I want to mix a deeper blue for the border, so I'm actually going to add a touch of the complementary orange to that blue to deepen it a little bit. Not too much, just ever so slightly to give it that darker edge, taking advantage of this super nice small brush tip to make my outline. I personally feel like using a colour instead of black makes it less stark. And why do my paint pans always end up looking so messy? Right, on to more mixing, and I want to mix up a nice green for the leaves and stalk. These greens in the palette are lovely, but they're not quite doing it for me on their own. And because I'm not quite sure what green I'm after, the best thing to do in this situation is to test a few. So I've grabbed a spare piece of paper and I'm going to do exactly that. Test out a few greens. I'm just going to keep going until I find one I like. like that middle one just there. So now I've got one I like and the rest of my paint's dry, I'm going to go for it. And this is where the small brush comes in handy again. I feel like I'm drawing as opposed to painting with it because it's so small. Great for all sorts of mark making as well, but we'll get onto that in a little minute. I've only used these paints a couple of times and I've completely ruined them. Okay, on to the fun bit. I get to add in the Pick pen. This is my comfort zone. I love an outline with a fine liner and I love adding in little details that probably don't even exist. But that's the fun of art, right? You can add in whatever character you want, so that's exactly what I'm going to do. Just make sure your paints are completely dry before going in with this pen because it will blend in with the water. Switching up your line width and altering the pressure. Don't be afraid to do those wiggly little lines in there either. Add outlines to your outlines and break up the line for more visual effect. It all adds to it. And of course, mark making with this paintbrush is super fun, so I'm going to finish up with some dots to the background and the tomatoes, adding much less water to that so it's a thicker, brighter paint.
Well, that was fun, and now I'm hungry. I hope you found this video useful. Let us know how you got on with this box in the comments below. Until next time, keep scrolling.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to give us the old like and subscribe for future videos. Have a lovely day.